The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but David was already awake. He had been staring at the ceiling for the past hour, thinking about the electricity bill that arrived yesterday. $230. His stomach twisted as he did the math in his head. After rent, groceries, and Lucy's school supplies, there wasn't much left. He quietly rolled out of bed, careful not to wake his 8-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room. Their small apartment had thin walls, and Lucy was a light sleeper. The last thing he wanted was for her to worry about money again. She was just a kid. She deserved to sleep peacefully. David pulled on his work uniform, a gray shirt with cleaning services printed on the back and dark blue pants that had seen better days. The fabric was worn soft from countless washes, but it was clean and respectable. That mattered to him. No matter how hard things got, he would always show up looking professional. He tiptoed to the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The machine was old and loud, but it still worked. While waiting for the coffee, he checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his supervisor about covering an extra shift this weekend. More work meant more money, which meant he could maybe take Lucy out for ice cream next week. He texted back, "Yes, I can do it." The coffee finished brewing, and David poured it into his old travel mug, a gift from Lucy last Christmas. She had saved her allowance for 2 months to buy it. The mug had "World's Best Dad" written in purple letters that were starting to fade. It was the most precious thing he owned. Before leaving, David peeked into Lucy's room. She was sleeping with her arms wrapped around an old tennis racket. He had found it at a yard sale last month for $5. Lucy had been asking about tennis lessons after seeing it on TV, but lessons cost money they didn't have. Instead, David had been teaching her in the park on weekends, using whatever he remembered from his own childhood. "Sleep tight, princess," he whispered and kissed her forehead. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes. David used this time to read. Today it was a book about investing that he had borrowed from the library. He dreamed of maybe starting a small business someday, something that would give Lucy a better future. But for now, dreams were free and jobs were real. Sterling Financial Tower stood 60 stories tall, reaching toward the sky like a glass and steel mountain. David had been working there for 3 years, and he still felt small every time he walked through the massive lobby. The marble floors reflected the crystal chandeliers above, and fresh flowers were arranged in expensive vases throughout the space. David nodded to the security guard, who barely looked up from his newspaper. Most people in the building didn't really see him. He was just the guy who emptied their trash and cleaned their offices. That was fine with David. Being invisible had its advantages. He could work in peace and didn't have to deal with office politics or fake conversations. He took the service elevator to the supply room in the basement. The other cleaners were getting ready for their shifts. There was Rosa, a grandmother from Mexico who sent money home to her family. There was Tommy, a college student working nights to pay for school. And there was Patricia, a single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs just to keep her kids fed. "Morning, David," Rosa called out in her cheerful voice. "How's our little Lucy doing?" "She's great." Still obsessed with tennis, David smiled, loading his cart with supplies. "That girl's got good taste. Tennis is a rich person's sport." "Maybe she'll be rich someday," Tommy laughed. David hoped so. He hoped Lucy would have opportunities he never had. That's why he worked so hard, saved every penny he could, and never complained about the long hours or aching back. By 6 a.m., David was on the executive floors. These were the fancy offices where the important decisions got made. The carpets were thick, the furniture was expensive, and everything smelled like leather and money. David moved quietly through the halls, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces. He could hear voices coming from the conference room. Someone was having an early meeting. David tried not to listen, but voices carry in empty hallways. "We need to cut costs somewhere." "What about the cleaning staff?" a woman's voice said. David froze. They were talking about his job. "Rachel, we can't run a building this size without proper cleaning," another voice replied. "Then we hire cheaper workers. These people are replaceable," the woman named Rachel said coldly. David's hands tightened on his mop handle. Replaceable. That's how she saw him and his coworkers. Not as people with families and dreams, but as expenses to be cut. He had heard about Rachel Sterling before. She was the CEO, only 32 years old and already worth millions. She had inherited the company from her father and turned it into one of the most successful financial firms in the city. The newspapers called her brilliant. The employees called her ruthless. David finished cleaning the floor and moved on. He had learned long ago not to take these things personally. Rich people lived in a different world. They didn't understand what it was like to choose between paying the phone bill or buying your daughter new shoes. Around 7 a.m., David was cleaning near the elevators when he heard the familiar sound of a tennis ball being hit. The building had tennis courts on the roof, and someone was up there practicing. The sound echoed down through the stairwell, sharp, rhythmic hits that spoke of skill and power. David paused in his work. That sound brought back memories he usually kept buried. For just a moment he closed his eyes and remembered what it felt like to hold a racket, to feel the sweet spot connect with the ball, to move across the court with grace and purpose. But that was another life, another person. Now he was just David the janitor, David who worried about electricity bills and worked double shifts so his daughter could have a better tomorrow. The sound of the tennis ball stopped, and David went back to his cleaning. He had work to do and Lucy would be waking up soon. Patricia from his building would walk her to school, same as every morning. Lucy never complained about not having fancy clothes or the latest toys. She was happy with their simple life, and that made everything worthwhile. As David pushed his cart toward the next office, he thought about Lucy's smile when she practiced tennis in the park. Maybe someday she would play on courts like the ones upstairs. Maybe someday she would have opportunities he could only dream of. For now, though, he would keep cleaning, keep working, and keep hoping. Because that's what fathers do. They sacrifice quietly and love unconditionally, even when the world doesn't notice they exist. 3 days later, David arrived at work earlier than usual. Lucy had a school field trip, and her teacher needed the permission slip signed first thing in the morning. The building was even quieter at 5:30 a.m., with only the security guards and a few early executives around. David took the elevator to the 50th floor to start with the executive offices. As the doors opened, he heard it again, the sharp sound of a tennis ball being struck with power and precision. Someone was already practicing on the rooftop courts. The sound echoed down through the building's core, rhythmic and intense. He pushed his cart down the hallway, but something was different today. One of the stairwell doors was propped open, and a tennis ball had rolled down the stairs and into the corridor. It sat there on the polished marble floor, bright yellow against the dark surface. David looked around. Nobody else was on this floor yet. He walked over and picked up the ball, turning it over in his hands. It was a high-quality ball, the kind that cost more than David spent on groceries in a day. For a moment he felt the familiar texture, the weight that brought back memories he tried to keep buried. Without thinking, David bounced the ball once against the floor. The sound was crisp and clean. He bounced it again, then caught it and held it steady. His muscle memory wanted to do more, but he stopped himself. This wasn't his world anymore. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice cut through the quiet like a knife. David turned to see a woman striding down the hallway toward him. She was tall and elegant, wearing expensive workout clothes and carrying a tennis racket that probably cost more than David made in a month. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and her face showed the kind of anger that came from someone who wasn't used to being inconvenienced. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I was just returning this," David said quietly, holding up the tennis ball. It rolled down from upstairs. The woman snatched the ball from his hands. "Do you have any idea what that equipment costs? Those balls are imported from Germany. Each one is worth more than—" She stopped and looked at David's uniform, her expression shifting from anger to disgust. "More than you probably make in a day." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I was just trying to help." "Help?" The woman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're the cleaning staff. Your job is to clean, not touch things that don't belong to you." David recognized her now. Rachel Sterling, the CEO. He had seen her picture in the business magazines that sometimes ended up in the break room. In person, she was even more intimidating than her photos suggested. "I understand, Miss Sterling, it won't happen again," David said, turning to go back to his cart. "Wait." Rachel's voice stopped him. "What's that?" David followed her gaze and realized she was looking at Lucy's tennis ball, which had fallen out of his jacket pocket when he bent to pick up hers. The cheap ball sat on the floor between them, faded with duct tape wrapped around a crack but still perfectly round. Rachel picked it up and examined it like it was some kind of strange artifact. Is this supposed to be a tennis ball? It belongs to my daughter, David said, reaching for it. Rachel pulled it away from him. Your daughter plays tennis? The way she said it made it sound impossible, like David had claimed his daughter could fly. She's learning. I teach her in the park on weekends. This made Rachel laugh even harder. You teach tennis? She bounced Lucy's ball on the floor, and it made a dull thud compared to her expensive ball. With this piece of garbage? David felt heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. She enjoys it. That's what matters. Enjoys it, Rachel repeated, shaking her head. Do you have any idea what real tennis looks like? What it takes to actually play this sport? Some idea, David said quietly. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She studied David more carefully now, taking in his worn uniform and tired face. You think you know tennis because you hit a ball around in the park with your kid? That's not tennis. That's just playing catch. Maybe you're right, David said, though something in his voice suggested otherwise. Rachel noticed the change in his tone. She was used to people backing down completely when she challenged them, but this janitor was different. There was something in his eyes, something that looked almost like confidence. You know what? I'm curious now, Rachel said, walking in a slow circle around David. You seem to think you know something about tennis. Have you ever even been on a real court? Have you ever played with actual equipment? Once or twice, David answered. The modesty in his response seemed to amuse Rachel even more. She stopped walking and faced him directly. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to teach you about real tennis, about knowing your place. David said nothing, but he didn't look away either. Rachel's smile was cold as winter. I play every morning at 6 a.m. on the rooftop courts. Best courts in the city, maintained by professionals. Tomorrow morning you're going to come up there and I'm going to show you what real tennis looks like. I'm not sure that's a good idea, ma'am. Oh, but I insist. Rachel's voice carried the tone of someone who always got what she wanted. In fact, let's make it interesting. Let's have a little match, you and me. David shifted uncomfortably. Miss Sterling, I don't think, what's wrong? Scared? Rachel interrupted. You talk like you know tennis, but you're afraid to actually play it. It's not about fear. It's about being realistic. Rachel laughed again. Realistic. Yes, let's be realistic. A janitor who thinks he can play tennis because he hits a broken ball around with his daughter. Do you know who I am? Do you know that I was captain of my college tennis team? That I've played at country clubs from here to California? David nodded. I'm sure you're very skilled. Skilled? Rachel's voice rose. I'm not just skilled. I'm elite. And you're... What exactly? A man who cleans toilets for a living and thinks that qualifies him to understand a sport like tennis? The insult hung in the air between them. David felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was like a sleeping part of him was waking up. All right, David said quietly. All right, what? I'll play you. Rachel blinked, surprised by his sudden agreement. You'll what? I'll play you. Tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. Now it was Rachel's turn to be speechless for a moment. She had expected him to back down, to apologize and scurry away. Instead, this janitor was accepting her challenge. Fine, Rachel said, recovering her composure, but let's make this worth my time. When I beat you and I will destroy you, you'll remember your place in this building. You'll know that there are levels in this world and you're at the bottom. And if I win? David asked. Rachel's laugh was sharp and cruel. If you win? If you somehow manage to win against me? She paused, thinking. If you could beat me at tennis, I'd marry you. The words came out before she could stop them. It was meant as a joke, the most ridiculous thing she could think of. The idea was so absurd that it made her point perfectly. This could never happen. David looked at her for a long moment. Is that a promise? What? Rachel was caught off guard by his serious tone. Is that a promise? If I beat you in tennis, you'll marry me? Rachel stared at him. There was something different about the way he was looking at her now. Gone was the humble, apologetic janitor. In his place stood someone who looked confident, almost dangerous. Yes, Rachel said, though she suddenly felt less certain than she had moments before. It's a promise, but when you lose, you'll know exactly where you belong in this world. David picked up Lucy's tennis ball from where Rachel had dropped it. He looked at it for a moment, then back at her. 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, he said. I'll be there. As David walked away, pushing his cart down the hallway, Rachel stood alone in the corridor. She should have felt victorious. She had put an uppity employee in his place and would humiliate him tomorrow in front of anyone who cared to watch. But something about the way David had looked at her in those final moments bothered her. It was almost like he knew something she didn't, like he was keeping a secret. Rachel shook her head and headed back to the courts. She had a reputation to maintain and a point to prove. Tomorrow she would remind everyone in this building exactly who was in charge. By lunchtime, everyone in Sterling Financial Tower knew about the tennis match. Word spread through the building like wildfire. The janitor had challenged the CEO to a game of tennis and she had accepted. Some people thought it was a joke. Others thought David had lost his mind. "Did you hear about the cleaning guy?" whispered Janet from accounting to her friend in the elevator. "The one who thinks he can beat Ms. Sterling at tennis? He must be crazy," came the reply. "I heard she promised to marry him if he wins," another voice added with a laugh. "Then he better start planning his funeral instead of a wedding." David heard the whispers as he worked. People were looking at him differently now, some with pity, others with amusement. A few seemed genuinely curious about what would happen tomorrow morning. David kept his head down and did his job, but inside his mind was racing. That evening, David picked up Lucy from after-school care. She was bubbling with excitement about her day, telling him about the science project she was working on and how her friend Katie had shared her lunch, when Lucy forgot hers. "Daddy, can we practice tennis today?" Lucy asked as they walked home from the bus stop. David's heart clenched. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart. Daddy has something he needs to take care of tonight." "Is everything okay?" Lucy looked up at him with those big, worried eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Everything's fine, Princess. Just some work stuff." After Lucy went to bed, David sat alone in their small living room. The TV was off and the apartment was quiet except for the sound of traffic outside. David stared at the closet door across the room, knowing what waited inside. He hadn't opened that closet in 3 years. Finally, David stood up and walked over to it. His hands shook slightly as he turned the handle. Behind the winter coats and old shoes pushed far back in the corner was a black tennis bag. It was expensive once, made of leather that had aged well despite being ignored for so long. David pulled the bag out and set it on the couch. The zipper stuck at first, unused for years, but eventually gave way. Inside were things from another life, things he thought he'd never need again. There were 3 tennis rackets, each one worth more than David made in a month. They were strung perfectly, balanced to his exact specifications. There were tournament programs with his picture on the covers, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and photographs of victories he barely remembered anymore. At the bottom of the bag was a magazine from 15 years ago. The cover showed a young man holding a trophy over his head, his face bright with joy and possibility. The headline read, "Rising Star, Danny Lightning Wilson takes the Miami Open." David stared at his younger self. Back then, he was Daniel Wilson, ranked number 12 in the world with endorsement deals and a future that seemed unlimited. He was 25 years old, married to the love of his life, and living a dream that millions of people could only imagine. The accident happened on a Tuesday night in March. David and his wife Jennifer were driving home from a charity dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light. Jennifer died instantly. David survived, but his left knee was shattered so badly that doctors said he'd be lucky to walk normally again, let alone play professional tennis. The rehabilitation took 2 years. By the time David could walk without a limp, his ranking had dropped to nothing. His sponsors had moved on and the tennis world had forgotten about Danny Wilson. He was just another player who couldn't handle the pressure and faded away, but they didn't know the real story. They didn't know about the nights David spent crying in hospital beds, or the months he spent learning to walk again, or the way his heart broke every time he saw a tennis ball because it reminded him of everything he had lost. When Jennifer's life insurance money ran out, David took the first job he could find, cleaning office buildings at night. He changed his name slightly, moved to a different city, and disappeared completely from the world that had once celebrated him. When Lucy was born a year later, David made a promise to himself. He would never risk losing her the way he had lost everything else. For the past 8 years, David had kept that promise. He worked hard, stayed invisible, and built a quiet life for his daughter. He taught her to play tennis with a cheap racket in the park because it made her happy. but he never let himself remember what it felt like to play at the highest level. Now, sitting in his living room with his old equipment spread out around him, David felt something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't quite hope, but it wasn't despair either. It was something in between, a dangerous feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could still be the person he used to be. David picked up one of his old rackets. The grip felt familiar in his hands, like shaking hands with an old friend. He stood up and took a few practice swings, careful not to wake Lucy. His form was still there, muscle memory preserved by years of playing with Lucy in the park. Even if she never knew she was learning from someone who once competed with the best players in the world. But could he still play at that level? It had been 15 years since he competed professionally. His knee still ached when it rained, and he was 40 years old now. Rachel Sterling was young, athletic, and had been playing regularly at elite country clubs. David was a middle-aged janitor with old injuries and reflexes that might have slowed down more than he wanted to admit. On the other hand, David thought about the way Rachel had treated him today. The way she had laughed at Lucy's tennis ball and mocked their weekend games in the park. The way she had called him replaceable and treated him like he was invisible. Maybe it was time to stop being invisible. David spent the next hour going through his old equipment, checking the strings on his rackets and finding tennis shoes that still fit. He looked at his reflection in the dark window and saw both versions of himself, Danny Wilson the tennis star and David the janitor. Tomorrow morning, for the first time in 8 years, those two people would have to become one. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in her luxury penthouse apartment, Rachel was soaking in her marble bathtub, a glass of wine in her hand. She had already forgotten about tomorrow's tennis match. It would be over in 20 minutes, probably less. She would win easily. The janitor would be humiliated. And everyone in the building would remember why she was in charge. Rachel had no idea that she was about to face someone who had once played in front of crowds of 20,000 people. Someone who had beaten players ranked in the top 10. Someone who had spent his entire youth learning to win when everything was on the line. She had no idea that tomorrow morning would change everything. As David finally went to bed that night, he looked in on Lucy one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, her old tennis racket still beside her pillow. David kissed her forehead and whispered, "Tomorrow, Daddy's going to show you what real tennis looks like." For the first time in 8 years, Danny Wilson was coming back. The question was whether David could handle what that meant. Saturday morning arrived gray and cloudy, with the threat of rain hanging in the air. By 5:45 a.m., word had spread so far that nearly 50 people had gathered on the rooftop of Sterling Financial Tower. Employees who never came to work on weekends had shown up just to watch the spectacle. Some brought coffee and pastries, turning it into an early morning entertainment. Rachel arrived 15 minutes early, looking like she had stepped out of a tennis magazine. Her outfit was pristine white, her shoes were spotless, and she carried a racket that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She warmed up with smooth, practiced strokes, and the crowd murmured, appreciatively at her obvious skill. "This is going to be embarrassing," someone whispered. "I almost feel bad for the guy." Another voice said, "Almost," came the laughing reply. Rachel felt confident and powerful. She had played tennis at the country club just yesterday, beating the club pro in straight sets. This morning would be a joke, a quick lesson in reality for someone who had forgotten his place in the world. At exactly 6 a.m., David appeared at the top of the stairs. He was wearing simple athletic clothes, old gym shorts, a faded t-shirt, and tennis shoes that had seen better days. He carried a beat-up tennis bag and walked with a slight limp that hadn't been there during his regular work. The crowd's chatter died down as people got their first good look at him. David looked around at all the faces staring at him. He recognized most of them, executives whose offices he cleaned, security guards who nodded at him in the hallways, administrative staff who sometimes said hello. Now they were all here to watch him get humiliated. "Well, well," Rachel called out with a bright smile. "Look who actually showed up. I was starting to think you had changed your mind." "I keep my promises," David said quietly, unzipping his bag. When he pulled out his racket, several people in the crowd chuckled. It was clearly expensive, but it was old and well used. The grip was worn smooth and the strings looked like they had been there for years. "That's your weapon of choice?" Rachel asked, bouncing a ball casually. "I hope you didn't spend too much on it." David didn't answer. He was stretching his left leg, working out the stiffness that always came when he first woke up. The old injury never fully went away, but it was manageable if he was careful. Should we get started? Rachel asked impatiently. I have a massage appointment at 8. They flipped a coin for the serve. Rachel won and chose to serve first. She took her position at the baseline, supremely confident. The crowd pressed closer to the court, phones already recording what they expected to be a short and one-sided match. Rachel's first serve was fast and precise, placed perfectly in the corner of the service box. David moved toward it, but his return was weak and caught the net. The crowd murmured appreciatively. 15, love, Rachel called out cheerfully. Her second serve was even better, an ace that David barely managed to touch with his racket. The ball flew wildly into the stands. 30, love. David looked uncomfortable, almost nervous. His movements seemed stiff, and he was clearly struggling with Rachel's pace. This was going exactly as everyone expected. By the end of the first game, Rachel had won easily. She was serving powerfully, moving well, and David looked like exactly what everyone thought he was, a middle-aged janitor who was in way over his head. This is painful to watch, someone in the crowd said. Why doesn't someone stop this? Another person asked. But something strange happened when David served for the first time. His motion was different, smoother, more natural. The ball came off his racket with unexpected pace, and Rachel had to work harder to return it. She still won the point, but it took longer than she expected. As the match continued, David seemed to be finding his rhythm. His shots were getting more accurate, and he was moving better around the court. Rachel was still winning, but she was having to hit more shots to win each point. He's better than I thought, someone in the crowd observed. Still not good enough, came the reply. Rachel won the first set, 6-2, but she was starting to sweat. David had won 2 games, and in both of them he had shown flashes of something that looked almost professional. During the break between sets, David sat on the bench and closed his eyes for a moment. He was remembering how it felt to play in front of crowds, how to block out everything except the ball in the court. Slowly, carefully, he was letting Danny Wilson wake up. The second set started differently. David's first serve was faster than anything he had hit all morning, and Rachel barely got her racket on it. The return went long. 15, love, David called out, and there was something different in his voice now. His second serve was placed perfectly in the corner, forcing Rachel to stretch for a difficult backhand return. David was waiting for it, and his forehand winner down the line brought gasps from the crowd. 30, love. Rachel looked surprised. Where had that shot come from? David held his serve easily, and suddenly the crowd was paying attention in a different way. That last game hadn't looked like a janitor struggling to keep up. It had looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. When Rachel served to start the second game, David was ready. He returned her serve with interest, a deep shot to the baseline that had her scrambling. The rally that followed was longer and more intense than anything they had played so far, with both players hitting powerful shots from all over the court. Finally, David ended it with a backhand down the line that Rachel couldn't reach. 15, love, David announced, and now his voice carried confidence. The crowd was getting excited. This wasn't the blowout they had expected. David was playing better with each point, moving with more grace, hitting with more power. His limp had disappeared completely, replaced by the fluid movement of someone who had spent their life on tennis courts. Who is this guy? Someone in the crowd whispered. Rachel was starting to look concerned. This janitor was hitting shots that belonged at country clubs, not public parks. His form was textbook perfect, and his strategy was sophisticated. She was still winning points, but she was having to work much harder for them. By the middle of the second set, the match had become a real contest. David was holding his serve easily now, and putting pressure on Rachel's serve with every return. The crowd was fully invested, cheering for good shots from both players. Then in the seventh game, something clicked for David. Rachel hit a short ball, and David moved forward to attack it. His approach shot was perfect, and when Rachel tried to pass him, David's volley was crisp and decisive. That was a professional shot, someone in the crowd said, loud enough for others to hear. Yeah, where did he learn to play like that? Another voice asked. An older man in the crowd squinted at David more carefully. There was something familiar about his style, something about the way he moved and struck the ball. The man pulled out his phone and started searching. David won that game, then broke Rachel's serve in the next. Suddenly, he was serving for the second set, and the crowd was buzzing with excitement. Rachel looked frustrated and confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. David's serve to win the set was an ace, placed so perfectly that Rachel could only watch it go by. "Set Wilson," David called out, using his real last name for the first time in 8 years. The older man in the crowd looked up from his phone. His eyes wide. "Oh my God," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I know who that is." The crowd turned to look at him. "That's Danny Wilson." Lightning Wilson. He was ranked number 12 in the world 15 years ago. He disappeared after some kind of accident, but that's definitely him. A murmur ran through the crowd as people started looking at David with new eyes. Phones came out as people began searching for pictures and videos of Danny Wilson in his prime. Rachel stood frozen at the baseline, her mouth slightly open. She was staring at David like she was seeing him for the first time. David looked around at the crowd, then back at Rachel. For 15 years he had been invisible. Now, for better or worse, Danny Wilson was back. "Your serve," he said simply, spinning his racket in his hand with the casual confidence of someone who had played this game at the highest level. The final set was about to begin, and everything had changed. The crowd had grown to over 100 people. Word was spreading through social media, and more employees were arriving by the minute. Someone had even called a local news station, and a reporter was setting up a camera near the court. Rachel stood at the baseline, but she looked nothing like the confident CEO who had arrived an hour earlier. Her perfect outfit was wrinkled with sweat, her hair was falling out of its ponytail, and her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her expensive racket. Across the net, David looked like a completely different person, too. Gone was the quiet, invisible janitor. In his place stood Danny Wilson, former world number 12, and every movement showed 15 years of muscle memory coming back to life. "This changes nothing," Rachel called out, trying to regain control of the situation.
"So what if you used to play professionally?"
"That was 15 years ago. You're old, out of shape, and working as a janitor because you couldn't cut it." David bounced the ball once, twice, then looked up at her with calm eyes. "Maybe you're right. Let's find out." His serve was a bullet placed so perfectly in the corner that Rachel could only watch it go by. The crowd erupted in cheers. 15 love, David announced. His second serve was just as good, and Rachel's desperate return flew wide. The crowd was getting louder with each point. Sensing they were watching something special, 30 love. Rachel tried to compose herself during the next point, but David was playing at a level she had never encountered. His shots were precise, powerful, and placed exactly where she couldn't reach them. When she managed to get the ball back, he was already moving to the perfect position for his next shot. David won the first game in 4 straight points, and the crowd gave him a standing ovation. As they changed sides, an older woman in the crowd approached the court. "Danny Wilson," she called out. "I remember you. You beat my son at the Miami Open in 2009. He still talks about that match." David nodded politely, but his focus remained on the court. He was playing for more than just himself now. He was playing for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told they didn't matter. Rachel's serve had lost its power. She was thinking too much, trying too hard, and making mistakes she never made at the country club. David broke her serve easily, then held his own with 4 more winners, 0 in the final set. "This is unbelievable," someone in the crowd said. "He's playing like he never left the tour. Look at those shots. That's not just skill, that's artistry." Rachel was falling apart. She had built her entire identity around being better than everyone else, and now she was being outclassed by someone she had called replaceable. Every shot David hit seemed to carry a message. "You were wrong about me." By the time David was serving for the match at 5-1, the crowd was completely silent. Everyone understood they were witnessing something rare, not just a tennis match, but a moment of redemption 15 years in the making. David's first match point was an ace down the middle. Rachel barely saw it. The crowd exploded in cheers, but David didn't celebrate. He walked to the net and extended his hand to Rachel, who stood frozen at the baseline. "Good match," he said quietly. Rachel stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly walked forward. When she shook his hand, her grip was weak and her eyes were wet with tears. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you working as a janitor? Why are you hiding who you are?" David looked around at the crowd, then back at her. "Because after I lost everything that mattered to me, I had to learn what really mattered. And it's not trophies or rankings or how much money you make. It's taking care of the people you love and treating others with dignity." whether they can do anything for you or not. The crowd was listening to every word, and many people were recording on their phones. "The bet," Rachel said suddenly, her voice barely audible. I said, "If you won, I would—" "The bet was cruel," David said firmly. "It was meant to humiliate me. I don't want anything from you except an apology to my daughter for mocking her tennis ball and her dreams." Rachel's tears were flowing freely now. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Not just to your daughter, but to you, and to everyone I've treated badly because I thought my money made me better than them." The crowd was completely quiet, watching this powerful woman confront the ugliness of her own behavior. David picked up his bag and started walking toward the stairs. The crowd parted to let him through, many people reaching out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. Someone shouted, "That was incredible!" Another person called out, "You're a legend!" But David didn't stop to enjoy the praise. He had somewhere more important to be. 20 minutes later, David was back in his apartment, still in his tennis clothes. Lucy was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, watching cartoons on the old tablet they shared. "Daddy, you're home early," she said with a smile. "And you look different. Why are you wearing tennis clothes?" David sat down next to her and pulled her onto his lap. "I had a tennis match this morning, Princess." "Really? Did you win?" "I did. Was it fun?" David thought about the question. Fun wasn't quite the right word for what had happened on that rooftop court. It had been necessary, painful, and ultimately liberating. "It was important," he said finally. "But you know what's more important than winning tennis matches?" "What?" "Having breakfast with my favorite person in the world." Lucy giggled and snuggled closer to him. "Can we play tennis in the park later? I want to practice my backhand." "Of course we can. But first, Daddy has something to tell you." David spent the next hour telling Lucy about his past, about being a professional tennis player, about her mother, and about why he had chosen to start over as someone new. Lucy listened with wide eyes, asking questions and trying to understand how her daddy had once been famous. "Does this mean we're rich?" she asked. David laughed. "No, sweetheart. I gave up that life a long time ago. We have enough money for what we need, and we have each other. That makes us richer than most people." "Good," Lucy said seriously. "I like our life just the way it is." Monday morning, David reported to work as usual. But everything had changed. The video of his match had gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments. News outlets were running stories about the janitor who used to be a tennis star. More importantly, Rachel had spent the weekend thinking about what David had said. On Monday, she called a meeting with all the cleaning staff and personally apologized for the way she had treated them. She also announced that the company would be increasing wages and benefits for all support staff. "You are not replaceable," she told them. "You are the foundation that makes everything else possible, and you deserve to be treated with respect." David continued working at Sterling Financial Tower, but now people knew who he really was. Instead of being invisible, he found himself having conversations with executives about perseverance, with security guards about second chances, and with other janitors about the dignity of honest work. Sometimes Rachel would see him in the hallways, and they would nod politely to each other. She never again mentioned the tennis match or the bet she had made. But every time she saw him, she remembered the lesson he had taught her about judging people by their circumstances instead of their character. 6 months later, David received an offer to coach tennis at an expensive private academy. The salary would have been 10 times what he made cleaning offices. But after talking it over with Lucy, he decided to stay where he was. "Why, Daddy?" Lucy asked. "Because this is where I'm needed," David said. "And sometimes the most important victories happen when nobody's keeping score." On weekends, David and Lucy still played tennis in the public park with her cheap racket and worn tennis balls. But now, sometimes other kids joined them, and David would teach them the same lessons his father had taught him years ago. That tennis, like life, isn't about having the best equipment or the most money. It's about working hard, treating your opponents with respect, and never giving up on yourself, even when the world tells you that you don't matter. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.